The marble floors of a Tech Spire tower gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights as David Mueller gripped his mop handle, listening to Elena Hoffmann's voice slice through the morning air. Dieser Hausmeister ist ein kompletter Versager, wie ein Hund der Befehle befolgt, she sneered to her assistant Klaus, gesturing at David with diamond-ringed fingers. The Billionaire CEO had no idea the janitor in grey coveralls understood every cruel German syllable. Her laughter echoed off pristine walls as she butchered quantum computing explanations to investors on speakerphone. David's jaw tightened with each technical error burning through him like acid. Then he straightened, his voice cutting through her arrogance like a blade. Entschuldigen Sie, Frau Hoffmann, aber Sie verwechseln Quantenverschränkung mit Quantensuperposition. The lobby fell silent. Elena's phone nearly slipped from her manicured hand as she stared at the man she'd just compared to a dog. What happened next would shatter everything this tech mogul thought she knew about power, respect, and the mysterious janitor cleaning her billion-dollar empire. Elena's perfectly composed mask cracked like thin ice under pressure. The German investors on the other end of her phone had fallen silent too, waiting for her response to the correction that had just exposed her ignorance. Klaus shuffled his feet nervously, his tablet clutched against his chest like a shield. David returned to his cleaning with deliberate calm, but Elena could see the quiet dignity in his movements now, the precision that spoke of something far beyond janitorial work. Her mind raced frantically, trying to process what had just happened. The morning commuters flowing through the lobby seemed to move in slow motion as she struggled to regain her composure. Where sind Sie? Elena whispered in German, her voice barely audible over the hum of the building's ventilation system. David looked up from his work, meeting her eyes with a steady gaze that held neither anger nor triumph, only a profound sadness that made her stomach clench. Jemand, der einmal Respekt verdiente und ihn vielleicht wieder verdienen wird, he replied quietly, his accent flawless and refined. Someone who once deserved respect, and perhaps will deserve it again. The words hung in the air like smoke, and Elena felt something shift deep in her chest, an uncomfortable recognition that she had just revealed more about herself than about him. Klaus cleared his throat hesitantly, glancing between his boss and the janitor who had just demolished her technical presentation with a single sentence. The German investors were beginning to murmur amongst themselves on the speakerphone, their confusion evident even through the tinny connection. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she lifted the phone back to her ear, forcing her voice into its usual commanding tone. Gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption. Let me clarify the technical specifications we discussed. But even as she spoke, she could feel David's presence like a weight in her peripheral vision, his quiet competence a stark contrast to her suddenly hollow authority. David pushed his cart toward the elevator bank, his movements economical and purposeful. Elena watched him go, noting details she had never bothered to observe before. The way he held his shoulders spoke of education, of confidence worn down but not entirely destroyed. His hands, though roughened by cleaning chemicals, moved with the precision of someone accustomed to delicate work. There was something in his bearing that reminded her uncomfortably of her own father, a brilliant engineer who had valued knowledge above status. The comparison made her chest tight with an emotion she couldn't quite name. The morning proceeded with mechanical normalcy, but Elena found herself unable to concentrate on the endless stream of meetings and calls that filled her schedule. Klaus noticed her distraction, offering concerned glances and gentle reminders about upcoming appointments. But Elena's mind kept returning to those few moments in the lobby, replaying David's words and the devastating quiet of his correction. She had built her empire on the assumption that intelligence and success were synonymous, that her wealth proved her superiority. Now a man in grey coveralls had shaken that foundation with a handful of German words. By noon, Elena's curiosity had transformed into obsession. She found herself making excuses to walk through areas where David might be working, catching glimpses of him restocking supply closets or mopping conference room floors. Each time she saw him, she noticed new details that challenged her initial assessment. The way he organized his supplies suggested systematic thinking. His interaction with other staff members was courteous but reserved, professional in a way that spoke of previous experience in corporate environments. He moved through the building like someone who understood its rhythms, who belonged there in ways that went beyond his current role. During her lunch break, Elena did something she had never done before. She accessed the building's employee database, searching for information about David Mueller. The file was surprisingly sparse, containing only basic employment information and emergency contact details. No previous work history, no educational background, no references beyond the minimum required for hire. It was the kind of deliberately blank profile that suggested someone with something to hide, or someone who had lost everything and needed to start over. The mystery deepened her fascination and her growing sense that she had made a terrible mistake. Elena's afternoon meetings dragged by with excruciating slowness. She found herself checking her watch repeatedly, counting the hours until the building would empty and she might have another chance to encounter David. Her assistant Klaus noticed her distraction, suggesting that perhaps she should consider rescheduling some of her appointments. But Elena couldn't explain the restless energy that had taken hold of her, the need to understand who David Mueller really was, and why his simple correction had affected her so profoundly. The quarterly reports on her desk remained untouched as she stared out her office window, watching the Denver skyline blur in the afternoon heat. The opportunity came at 6 in the evening, when most of the building's occupants had departed for their suburban homes and family dinners. Elena found David in the 42nd floor conference room, methodically cleaning the massive table where she had hosted the German investors earlier that week. The room was dimly lit, shadows pooling in the corners, and the silence felt different from the charged tension of the morning encounter. This time, Elena approached with something resembling respect, though pride still kept her spine straight and her voice controlled. "I need to know who you are," Elena said in English, her usual commanding tone softened by genuine curiosity. David continued his work without looking up, his cloth moving in steady circles across the polished surface. "I'm someone who cleans this table every Tuesday evening, Frau Hoffmann. Nothing more complicated than that." His English carried the same precision as his German, educated and articulate in ways that made her chest tighten with recognition. There was a story here, a fall from grace that resonated with fears she had never acknowledged about her own precarious position at the top. Elena moved closer, her heels clicking against the marble floor in the empty conference room. "You corrected my explanation of quantum entanglement this morning. That's not the knowledge of a janitor." David's hands stilled for a moment before resuming their careful work, and Elena caught a glimpse of something that might have been pain flickering across his features. "Knowledge is like muscle memory," he said quietly. "It doesn't disappear just because your circumstances change. Sometimes it's the only thing that remains when everything else is stripped away." The admission hung between them like a bridge, and Elena felt herself stepping onto uncertain ground. She had built her life on the assumption that success was permanent, that achievement created an unassailable fortress against failure and loss. But David's presence suggested a different truth, one that made her comfortable worldview feel suddenly fragile. "What happened to you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question surprised her with its vulnerability, revealing a genuine concern that felt foreign and uncomfortable. David set down his cleaning cloth and looked at her directly for the second time that day. In the dim light of the conference room, his face showed the weathered dignity of someone who had survived losses she couldn't imagine. "Life happened, Frau Hoffmann. The same thing that could happen to anyone, regardless of how secure they think their position might be." His words carried no bitterness, only a quiet acceptance that made Elena's throat constrict with unexpected emotion. The following morning brought a new dynamic to their encounters. Elena found herself arriving at the office earlier, timing her entrance to coincide with David's morning cleaning routine. She told herself it was coincidence, but Klaus noticed the change in her schedule and asked if there were new appointments requiring her early arrival. Elena deflected his questions, unwilling to admit that she was deliberately seeking contact with the building's janitorial staff. The truth felt too complicated and too revealing of needs she didn't want to acknowledge. David seemed to sense her increased attention, and he began altering his own schedule to avoid prolonged contact. He would disappear into supply closets when he saw her approaching, take different routes through the building, and maintain professional distance when interaction was unavoidable. His avoidance only intensified Eleanor's curiosity and her growing sense that she had encountered someone whose story might change her understanding of success and failure. The cat-and-mouse game they developed felt both frustrating and oddly intimate. On Thursday morning, Elena's patience finally cracked. She cornered David in the supply closet on the 38th floor, blocking his exit with her body and her determination. "You can't avoid me forever," she said, her voice carrying the authority she used in boardroom negotiations. "I know you're not who you pretend to be." David's jaw tightened, and for a moment she saw a flash of the man he must have been before circumstances reduced him to grey coveralls and cleaning supplies. "I'm exactly who I appear to be, Frau Hoffmann. Someone who needs this job to support his family." The mention of family caught Elena off guard, adding another layer to the mystery she was trying to solve. "You have children?" she asked, her tone softening despite her effort to maintain control of the conversation. David's expression shifted, revealing a tenderness that transformed his entire face. "A son, 8 years old. He's the reason I do this work, the reason I swallow my pride and accept whatever employment I can find." The explanation hit Eleanor like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the reality of economic desperation she had never personally experienced. Elena stepped back, allowing David space to leave, but her mind was churning with new questions and uncomfortable realizations. The image of David as a devoted father complicated her understanding of his situation and her own behavior toward him. She had mocked a man who was sacrificing his dignity to provide for his child, someone whose love manifested in the humbling work she had used to diminish him. The recognition of her cruelty settled in her stomach like a stone, heavy and indigestible. That afternoon, Elena made a decision that surprised even herself. She called her private investigator, a discreet professional she occasionally employed for background checks on potential business partners. "I need you to research someone for me," she said, providing David's full name and employment information. "I want to know everything about his background, his education, his previous employment, and what brought him to his current circumstances." The investigator promised results within 48 hours, and Elena felt a mixture of anticipation and guilt about the invasion of privacy she was commissioning. Friday brought an unexpected development that changed the trajectory of Elena's investigation. At 3:30 in the afternoon, a small boy appeared in the TechSpire lobby, his school backpack slung over one shoulder and his face bright with the anticipation of weekend freedom. Elena watched from the mezzanine level as David emerged from a service corridor, his entire demeanor transforming the moment he saw the child. The man who had seemed reserved and guarded melted into someone warm and openly affectionate, his face illuminating with a smile that took Elena's breath away. She observed their interaction with growing fascination and something that might have been envy. David knelt to the boy's level, listening intently as Tommy recounted his day at school with animated gestures and infectious enthusiasm. The love between father and son was evident in every gesture, every shared laugh, every gentle correction David offered when Tommy's storytelling became too exuberant. Elena found herself thinking of her own childhood, of the corporate efficiency that had characterized her relationship with her workaholic parents. Tommy noticed Elena watching from the mezzanine and waved with the unself-conscious friendliness of childhood. "Is that lady your boss, Dad?" he asked in a voice that carried clearly through the lobby's acoustics. David glanced up at Elena, his expression carefully neutral. "She's the CEO of the company that owns this building, son. A very important person." The respect in his voice stung Elena more than mockery would have, highlighting the generosity of spirit she had failed to recognize or reciprocate. Elena descended the stairs slowly, drawn by impulses she didn't fully understand. As she approached, Tommy stepped slightly behind his father, suddenly shy in the presence of adult authority. But his curiosity overcame his reserve, and he peered around David's legs with bright, intelligent eyes that reminded Elena painfully of her younger self. "What's a CEO?" Tommy asked, and Elena found herself crouching down to his level, something she had never done with any child. "A CEO is someone who makes decisions for a company," Elena explained, surprised by the gentleness in her own voice. "I decide what projects we work on and how we spend our money." Tommy considered this seriously, his head tilted in concentration. "That sounds like a lot of responsibility," he said solemnly. "Dad says responsibility is what makes people grown up." The simple wisdom of his observation hit Eleanor with unexpected force, reminding her that responsibility extended beyond profit margins and stock prices to include the treatment of other human beings. David placed a protective hand on Tommy's shoulder, his body language suggesting readiness to shield his son from any harm Elena might represent. The gesture spoke volumes about his past experiences with authority figures and his learned wariness of those who held power over his livelihood. Elena felt the weight of that distrust and recognized it as entirely justified given her behavior earlier in the week. She had become exactly the kind of person a vulnerable father would need to protect his child from. The weekend passed slowly for Elena, filled with social obligations and business dinners that felt increasingly hollow and meaningless. She found herself thinking about David and Tommy, imagining their modest weekend activities and feeling envious of their obvious connection. Her penthouse apartment, with its designer furniture and spectacular views, felt cold and empty in comparison to the warmth she had witnessed between father and son. The contrast forced her to examine aspects of her life she had never questioned before. Monday morning brought the investigator's report, a thick folder that contained the answers Elena had been seeking. As she read, her understanding of David Mueller underwent a complete transformation. The man she had mocked as an uneducated janitor held a PhD in electrical engineering from MIT, with specialized expertise in quantum computing and semiconductor design. His previous position had been as Senior Research Director at Quantum Dynamics, a defense contractor where he had led groundbreaking work on military applications of quantum technology. The report detailed David's fall from grace with clinical precision. 3 years earlier, he had discovered that Quantum Dynamics was secretly selling his quantum processor designs to foreign governments for use in surveillance systems targeting civilian populations. When David threatened to expose the illegal sales, the company had retaliated by destroying his career through a coordinated campaign of professional sabotage. Legal fees from fighting the company had bankrupted him, and his wife Maria had died of cancer during the stress of the lawsuit, her medical bills consuming their remaining assets. Elena set the report aside, her hands trembling with the weight of what she had learned. The man she had compared to a dog was actually one of the world's leading experts in her own company's core technology. His current circumstances resulted not from failure or inadequacy, but from moral courage that had cost him everything. The irony was devastating and inescapable. She had mocked someone whose integrity far exceeded her own, whose sacrifice had been motivated by principles she claimed to respect but had never been tested on. The revelation demanded action, but Elena found herself paralyzed by the magnitude of her mistake and the complexity of potential solutions. Simply offering David a position in her company felt inadequate and potentially insulting, given what she now understood about his background and the reasons for his current situation. He had chosen moral principle over career advancement, accepting poverty rather than compromise his ethics. Her wealth and success, built partly on the same kinds of morally questionable technologies David had rejected, suddenly felt tainted and meaningless. Tuesday morning found Elena waiting in the lobby before dawn, determined to confront David with her newfound knowledge and somehow begin to atone for her behavior. When he arrived for his early shift, she stepped forward with uncharacteristic hesitation, the investigator's report clutched in her hands like evidence of her own moral failure. To Mueller, she said quietly, using his proper title for the first time. I know who you are. I know what happened to you. David's face went pale, then hardened with something approaching anger. What gives you the right to investigate my private life? He asked, his voice low but carrying unmistakable authority. For the first time since their initial encounter, Elena felt genuinely intimidated by his presence, recognizing the force of personality that had once commanded research teams and million-dollar budgets. The man in grey coveralls had momentarily given way to the brilliant scientist he had been, and Elena found herself struggling to maintain her composure. I had to know, Elena said, her usual confidence deserting her completely. I had to understand why you corrected me, how you knew about quantum entanglement. I couldn't let it go. David's jaw tightened, and Elena saw the effort it took him to maintain his professional demeanor. And now that you know, what do you intend to do with that information? Use it to humiliate me further? Threaten my employment here? The pain in his voice cut through Elena's defenses, forcing her to confront the cruelty of her actions and their potential consequences. Elena shook her head frantically, desperate to communicate her genuine remorse and growing respect. I want to apologize, she said, the words feeling foreign and inadequate. I want to understand how someone with your background ended up here, and what I can do to help. David laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the empty lobby. Help? You want to help the man you compared to a trained dog, the janitor whose technical knowledge you dismissed as impossible. The weeks that followed established a new pattern of interaction between Elena and David, marked by cautious conversation and gradual mutual understanding. Elena found herself seeking his opinion on technical matters, initially as a form of apology, but increasingly because she genuinely valued his expertise. David remained guarded, but began sharing insights that improved several of her company's projects, his contributions made anonymously to protect both their reputations. The clandestine collaboration felt both healing and dangerous, challenging the rigid hierarchies that governed their professional world. Tommy's presence continued to complicate and humanize their relationship. The boy began visiting the office more frequently, his cheerful acceptance of Elena gradually breaking down her carefully constructed emotional barriers. She found herself looking forward to his questions about business and technology, his innocent curiosity reminding her of her own childhood fascination with her father's engineering work. Through Tommy, Elena began to understand the depth of David's sacrifice and the daily courage required to maintain dignity in circumstances that would have broken lesser men. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening when Elena discovered David working late in the research lab, reviewing quantum processor specifications that her team had been struggling to understand. He stood before a whiteboard covered with equations, his movements confident and precise as he worked through complex calculations. For a moment, Elena forgot about their respective positions and saw only a brilliant mind engaged with challenging material, the natural habitat of someone born to solve impossible problems. You're working on this Munich project, Elena observed, stepping into the lab without her usual announcement. David turned, startled but not defensive, his face flushed with the excitement of intellectual engagement. Your team's approach to quantum decoherence is fundamentally flawed, he said, his professional instincts overriding personal caution. You're trying to solve the wrong problem, which is why your error rates remain unacceptably high. Elena moved closer to the whiteboard, studying equations that represented months of work by her highest-paid engineers. "Show me," she said simply, offering him the marker with a gesture that acknowledged his expertise. For the next 2 hours, they worked together as equals, David explaining the theoretical foundations, while Elena contributed practical insights about manufacturing constraints and market requirements. The collaboration felt natural and energizing, reminding Elena why she had originally been drawn to technology rather than pure business management. As their working relationship deepened, Elena began to understand the full scope of what David had lost and why his sacrifice had been necessary. The quantum surveillance technology he had refused to develop was now being used by authoritarian governments to monitor and suppress their own citizens, exactly as he had predicted. His moral stand had prevented him from profiting from oppression, but it had also ensured that others would develop similar technologies without his ethical constraints. The realization forced Elena to examine her own company's practices and partnerships with uncomfortable honesty. TechSpire had contracts with several governments whose human rights records were questionable at best, providing them with surveillance capabilities that could be used against innocent civilians. The profits from these contracts funded her lifestyle and her employees' salaries, creating a moral complexity that David had chosen to reject at enormous personal cost. Elena made her decision on a Friday morning, calling an emergency meeting with her board of directors to announce the immediate termination of all surveillance contracts with authoritarian regimes. The decision would cost TechSpire millions in revenue and potentially damage relationships with important clients. But Elena found herself caring more about David's opinion than her shareholders' profits. The conversation was difficult and heated, with several board members questioning her judgment and demanding detailed justifications for the sudden policy change. When the board meeting concluded, Elena sought out David to inform him of her decision. She found him in the children's play area that TechSpire maintained for visiting families, sitting on a tiny plastic chair while Tommy built elaborate structures with colorful blocks. The scene struck Elena as both touching and absurd. This brilliant scientist reduced to weekend childcare in a corporate playground. But David's face showed only contentment and love, his attention fully focused on his son's creative efforts. "I terminated our surveillance contracts," Elena announced without preamble, her usual corporate communication style feeling suddenly inappropriate in the playful setting. David looked up sharply, his expression cycling through surprise, understanding, and something that might have been pride. "That will cost your company significant revenue," he observed, his tone neutral but his eyes watchful. Elena sat down on another tiny chair, ignoring the absurdity of conducting serious business conversation in a room designed for children. "Some costs are worth paying," she said, meeting David's gaze directly. "You taught me that there are things more important than profit margins." Tommy looked up from his blocks, sensing the adult tension, but not understanding its source. "Dad, is the nice lady sad about something?" he asked with the directness of childhood. David's expression softened as he looked at his son, then back at Elena. "No, Tommy. I think she's just learning something important about what it means to make good choices." The gentle correction contained layers of meaning that Elena was only beginning to understand, lessons about integrity and sacrifice that her business education had never addressed. The transformation of their relationship accelerated after Elena's policy change, moving from cautious respect toward something approaching friendship. David began joining Elena for occasional coffee breaks, their conversations ranging from technical discussions to personal reflections on success, failure, and the complex relationship between ambition and morality. Elena discovered that David's intelligence extended far beyond his technical expertise, encompassing philosophy, literature, and the kind of wisdom that came from surviving profound loss with dignity intact. Tommy's presence continued to serve as a bridge between their different worlds, his innocent questions forcing both adults to examine their assumptions and explain their choices in terms a child could understand. Elena found herself becoming genuinely fond of the boy, appreciating his curiosity and his unconscious ability to find joy in simple pleasures. Through Tommy, she began to understand what she had been missing in her relentless pursuit of professional achievement. The climax of their evolving relationship came during a late evening, when Elena discovered David crying silently in the empty conference room where they had first spoken privately. Tommy had been hospitalized earlier that day with appendicitis, and David's carefully maintained composure had finally cracked under the weight of worry and helplessness. Elena found him staring out the window at the city lights, tears streaming down his face as he struggled with fears no parent should have to face alone. Elena approached carefully, unsure how to offer comfort to someone whose strength she had come to depend upon. "Tommy will be fine," she said softly, her usual confidence replaced by gentle uncertainty. "Children are resilient, and he has the best medical care." David nodded without turning around, his shoulders shaking with suppressed emotion. "I know that intellectually," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "But he's all I have left. If something happened to him..." The vulnerability in David's voice broke through Elena's remaining emotional barriers, revealing the loneliness and fear that success had masked but never eliminated. She moved closer, placing a tentative hand on his shoulder in a gesture of comfort that felt both natural and terrifying. "He won't be alone," she heard herself saying. "Whatever happens, he won't be alone." The promise surprised her with its sincerity and its implications for her own carefully ordered life. Tommy's recovery proceeded smoothly, but the crisis had changed something fundamental between Elena and David. The barriers of professional hierarchy and personal history had dissolved in the face of shared concern for an innocent child, revealing the human connection that had been developing beneath their complex negotiations of power and respect. Elena found herself visiting the hospital regularly, bringing books and games to entertain Tommy during his recovery, her presence welcomed by both father and son. When Tommy returned to school, Elena made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She offered David a consulting position with TechSpire, one that would utilize his expertise while allowing him the flexibility to prioritize his parental responsibilities. The offer was generous, but not patronizing, recognizing his talents without treating him as a charity case. David considered the proposal carefully before accepting, understanding that it represented not just employment, but Eleanor's acknowledgement of his worth as both a professional and a human being. The announcement of David's appointment to TechSpire's technical advisory board created ripples throughout the company and the broader tech industry. Some viewed it as Eleanor's eccentricity, others as brilliant recognition of hidden talent. But for Elena and David, the professional arrangement was less important than the personal transformation it represented. They had moved from antagonism through understanding to genuine mutual respect, a journey that had changed both their perspectives on success, failure, and the complex relationship between moral courage and material achievement. 6 months later, Elena stood in the same lobby where their confrontation had begun, watching David explain quantum computing principles to a group of visiting investors. His confidence had returned gradually, nurtured by meaningful work and Elena's consistent support. Tommy sat nearby, working on homework while occasionally looking up to smile proudly at his father's presentation. The scene embodied everything Elena had learned about the relationship between personal dignity and professional competence. As the investors departed, clearly impressed by David's expertise and Elena's innovative approach to talent development, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The woman who had once mocked a janitor for his apparent ignorance had learned to value wisdom over credentials, character over status. David had taught her that true strength lay not in the ability to diminish others, but in the courage to lift them up, even at personal cost. The last rays of afternoon sunlight streamed through the lobby's floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor that David had once cleaned with such careful precision. Now he stood in the same space as an equal, his expertise recognized and his dignity restored. But more than that, he had become Eleanor's teacher in matters that business school had never addressed, lessons about integrity, sacrifice, and the complex relationship between success and happiness. Eleanor approached David as he packed up his presentation materials, Tommy already at his side with backpack ready for the journey home. "Excellent presentation," she said, her praise sincere and specific rather than patronizing. David smiled, the expression reaching his eyes in a way that reminded Elena of their first real conversation, when walls had begun to crumble and understanding had taken root. "Thank you, Elena," David replied, using her first name as he had learned to do in their months of collaboration. "For everything." The gratitude in his voice encompassed more than professional opportunity, acknowledging the personal courage she had shown in examining her own behavior and choosing change over comfortable complacency. Tommy tugged at his father's sleeve, eager to begin their weekend adventure. But before they left, he turned to Elena with the serious expression he wore when something important needed to be said. "Elena, Dad says you taught him that good people can make mistakes and still be good people. Is that true?" The question, delivered with childhood's devastating directness, captured the essence of everything they had learned together. Elena knelt to Tommy's level, meeting his earnest gaze with the honesty he deserved. "Yes, Tommy, I think that's true. But the important thing is learning from our mistakes and trying to do better." The boy nodded solemnly, processing this adult wisdom with the gravity it deserved. Then his face brightened with a smile that reminded Elena why she had come to love this remarkable child and his extraordinary father. As David and Tommy left the building together, their voices echoing in the lobby as they discussed weekend plans and Monday's school presentation, Elena remained behind in the quiet space where her transformation had begun. The marble floors still gleamed under fluorescent lights, but everything else had changed. She had learned that true leadership meant recognizing excellence wherever it appeared, that real strength lay in admitting mistakes and seeking redemption. The story of Elena Hoffman and David Mueller had become legend within TechSpire, a reminder that assumptions about worth and capability could be devastatingly wrong, that dignity resided in character rather than circumstances, and that the most profound education came not from textbooks, but from the courage to see beyond surface appearances to the human truth beneath. Their unlikely partnership had produced innovations that advanced both technology and corporate ethics, proving that success built on mutual respect was both more sustainable and more satisfying than victory achieved through the diminishment of others. Elena's last act before leaving the office that evening was to update David's nameplate, ensuring that his proper title was displayed with the respect it deserved. "Dr. David Mueller, Senior Technical Advisor," the small brass rectangle proclaimed. But more important than any title was the knowledge that he had earned his place through expertise rather than charity, that his contributions were valued for their merit rather than tolerated out of pity. The transformation was complete, but the learning continued. Elena had discovered that the most valuable lessons often came from the most unexpected teachers, that wisdom might be found in grey coveralls as easily as corner offices, and that the measure of true success lay not in the ability to look down on others, but in the strength to lift them up. In learning to see David Mueller clearly, she had finally learned to see herself.